Alyssa, if you can come off mute and join the panel around, when we caught up, you told me about a couple of things that you took away from Coaching for Impact. First of all, the way to kind of structure a training session. Can you elaborate on that and what you did pick up and how it's transformed your coaching? I know you have some slides, so please let me know when you want me to put something up for you. Okay, but what did you pick up and how was it transformed your coaching?
Yeah, so I had a story about red brain and green brain as well. But I'll maybe hold that till the end. The different ways of structuring a training session, I think, were really eye-opening for me, because something that the program allowed us to do is reflect on why we coach the way that we do and where those ideas come from. So I think naturally we're going to coach the way that we were coached. And if you come from a certain generation, then you might have come from, if you were coached from the generation or two above you, then, they're carrying with them their experience as well. And so we're sort of just repeating this process of traditional coaching models. And to me, that looks like being very coach driven. The coach comes in with the plan, the coach comes with the answers. Training structure is really repetitive. They might say, this is the outcome. This is exactly how we need to get to that outcome. And then if you don't get to that outcome, you're not on the right track. There's a right way to do things and a wrong way to do things. Mm-hmm. And pretty clearly whether you're in the right way or the wrong way. And I think because of that, it means that skills are the focus first, and then the outcome or application comes later. So that's sort of like the traditional model. And I didn't realize that that's exactly what I was replicating in the gym with my athletes, because that's how I was coached as a teenager. And I think there was, and I didn't even realize it was across sports as well. You come into the gym, you warm up with some balls. There might be a bit of running, some stretching. You're going to do some pepper, something in small groups. It's going to be skill based, and then some simplistic drills focusing on one or two skills. And then maybe at the end, you're going to do something game-like, right?
But
so
usually only if you advanced and completed.
Right. And when they were saying this, and it wasn't even a volleyball coach who was saying this, I was like, okay, I feel targeted. Like that's what my trainings are like. And I had to sort of step back, but then alongside the questioning also came the strategies. So one of the strategies that they talked about in the program was something called game sense coaching. And I was like, here's a buzzword, like, is it actually going to work? But essentially, if the traditional approach is the skill first and then the application, game sense is like the opposite. So it's introduce what to do first and then how to do it afterwards. And to me, it also means that the players are interested because they get to do the outcome rather than listen to you talk about the outcome for too long. They just get to get into it. But it's uncomfortable as a coach because it's not linear. Like to me, and especially being a secondary school teacher, I'm like, this is a scaffolding process. Like, just go with it, guys. I'll take you with me, sort of thing. But this is the opposite, where I'm just like, let's just chuck you in the deep end, and it may not work, which is an uncomfortable space. And then we'll fix it together, which is cool. And something that really stood out to me about Game Sense is the study that was part of Game Sense, was where someone came to a rugby training and they tracked athletes and the distance between how long it took for an athlete to touch a rugby ball. So how long are they standing in lines, essentially? And then over the course of a training, so say, for example, I think the athlete they were tracking was like 80 seconds between touches in a drill. And so then if that's how the training is structured, over an hour or 2 hours, how many times are they actually touching a ball? And so we know that in ball handling drills, the more you touch the ball, the better you're going to get. But are the structure of our trainings actually going to bring about that outcome? So that was triggering for me too, because in volleyball, like hitting lines. So there's one person at the front waiting to be set to, who's going to practice their hitting. And there's 4 or 5 people sometimes standing behind them waiting for a ball. How long are they waiting? Right. And am I wasting their time? They're not touching a ball. So how do I increase all of that? So I just did want to go through the process of Game Sense on a slide, if that's okay, just because when I heard it, I was sort of overwhelmed by the concept. And now that I put it into practice, I feel better about it.
100% happy to do that.
So
just want to let you know that
cool.
your bandwidth is quite low. Everyone can still hear you, but there's a bit of a delay between you and I. It's okay. It's okay. There's a delay between you and I. I'll get the slides up. While I'm bringing up the slides, I just wanted to share, I'm quite similar in that regard. I used to coach exactly the same way, and this came about for me as well. What I like to do in session design is create a scenario that exaggerates a component of the game, whether it's technically, tactically, physically, and it can be pretty messy at times. The session I ran tonight was really messy. And then break the activity down to work on a specific component. The players can then identify what we need to develop, why we need to, and they tend to be more motivated to work on it because they can then appreciate that it'll give an advantage to them when they return to the activity, as opposed to going, we need the skill before we can compete in the game. We go actually game, exaggerate the skill, work on the skill, bring it back into the game. Let me bring up this. It looks like your bandwidth is awesome again. So there you go. There's your slide. If you want to talk through Game Sense.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Sean. So again, essentially the way that you would structure it, so this isn't on the slide, but you're going to come up with a game first, and you're going to start with that rather than thinking about individual skills or techniques that you want to work on in the buildup of a drill. You might just start the game first, and hopefully that game is something that's going to bring several skills or techniques together. Then the second bullet point is the thing that's the most uncomfortable. So preparing for it to fail, because your assumption, or my assumption going into it, is that they're lacking a key skill. And actually that's a benefit to Game Sense, because after it doesn't work, see, in previous times I would be like, oh no, I have to have all the answers. This drill didn't work. How do I fix this on the spot? I don't want them to think I don't know what I'm doing, right? But instead it doesn't work. And then the group comes together, and I might ask some open-ended questions and ask them why they think it's not working. What are the key skills that we're missing here? What techniques do we need to work on? And then they identify them almost always, or they might require some more questioning, but it means instantly there's buy-in from them to work on those techniques.
It's their idea. Yeah.
I'm like, oh, wow, that's a great idea. We absolutely should be working on our passing, like, fantastic. I'm so glad you came up with that. But then you go away and you work on those skills. And then when you return to the game, hopefully it's improved the outcome. Yep. So I just thought a practical example of something I've done in a training that's volleyball related is something like peppering isn't actually game-like. It doesn't bring about the same skills as what you would do in an actual volleyball game. And so just recently I started having my players warm up in teams of 2 or 3 against other teams of 2 or 3, but splitting the court in half. So you can have, and it's really flexible for the numbers that you have in the gym as well. But essentially the rules of the game is to keep the ball in play and for each side to have 3 contacts. So then you just sort of allow the drill to run, and hopefully there's some ball control. But then we'll pull it together and say, are there any skills here that we aren't using? And then they themselves identified that trying to keep the ball in play meant that they were avoiding things like down balls or harder spikes, right? And so they can identify, and then I might ask something like, what are the downsides to that choice? And they'll say, well, we aren't warming up our shoulders. We're not challenging ourselves to defend. We're not working on, our footwork or that sort of thing, because we have plenty of time to react to the ball. And then I might say something like, well, what can we do to fix that? Because the idea is that it all needs to be their idea. So they'll say, well, maybe we should add an overarm swing. Maybe we could start with like a down ball or a roll shot or something just to get used to it. And then if it goes okay, we could crank it up, to full spikes, that sort of thing. And so we play the drill again and implement their ideas. But the idea is that, they've identified the gaps in their own training and that they can identify what the key skills of the game are, because none of those things came from me. Like I could have talked for minutes upon minutes about and think about this. Right, exactly. Yep. And they're totally zoned out because they've got other things on their mind. But also they're challenging themselves to increase the intensity rather than that, come on, guys, give it some more effort.
They've set
and they
the
can reflect. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And
so the motivation comes from them.
Yeah. And if we go back to red brain, green brain, like we're thinking resilience, we're thinking self-reliance, like at the end of the day, like we're not the ones playing the game, they are. And if we can build these skills through the way we structure training, that's super exciting. Love that. Is there anything else you want to add around game sense? Or
I think that, well, game sense sort of leads similarly onto what we're going to talk about next, I know, but just the idea that not to be afraid to shake up what trainings are. And I think when we have athletes who have been playing volleyball for a long time, they may be used to or have been coached by coaches who run a training in that traditional fashion. And so coming to a game sense led training or a non-linear training where the coach doesn't have all the answers and is asking them to reflect and be part of the planning and discussion can be an uncomfortable space for everybody.
Yes.
You know, what are they going to think about me if they come to my training? It'll be quite different to that. But I think really it leads really well into what Natalia was talking about in terms of what's the environment that we're creating for athletes.
100%.
You know, where they feel like seen and valued and all those sorts of things. And in order to create that environment, it can't all be about me as the coach, which is uncomfortable.
And definitely, and it will look messy at times as well, and being like comfortable with the chaos, like organized chaos. And one thing that I've picked up recently with regard to this is that traditionally people aren't coached this way. The school system doesn't potentially teach them this way in the way that they do maths and English and so forth. That's another conversation, but it's unfamiliar as well for the participant to, I'm being asked a question, or I'm being made to think for myself. And so actually we need to take the learner on a journey here as well, as opposed to, this is my opinion, as opposed to really throwing them right in the deep end. Like, can we build to this? Give them the tools to be able to do this, I think is important, as opposed to scaring the living daylights out of them. Very cool. And hey, you alluded to the next piece that you'd like to talk about around this concept of constraints-led approach, which is, I'm conscious of time, and if people do need to leave at 8:15, go for it. But we might sneak to 8:20 if you've got the time for everyone. But Alyssa, share for us this concept of constraints-led approach, and can you give an example of how that's played out in your coaching practice? And let me know when you want me to move to the next slide.
Cool. Okay. So the constraints-led approach has some overlap with game sense in that its outcomes are similar. It's really about moving away from traditional coaching and into something that is supposed to challenge that direct teaching model. But essentially, what we work in coaching or in any sport is variables of performance. And as coaches, when we plan a training session or a drill or a game, what we need to be able to do is manipulate variables to challenge athletes to work on a specific skill. And I think most drills are designed this way naturally, but I think what constraints-led approach does is it challenges what those constraints could possibly be. So there's different aspects of constraints, things like, individual constraints that could be something about their physical size, but it could also be their mental skills. It could be something about, the environment, the temperature, like make them play volleyball in the freezing cold. I don't know what that would do. But it could also, I think most of what we do is task constraints. So things around the rules of a game or a drill, the size of the court, the amount of players, that sort of stuff. But essentially thinking about the constraints in a more critical way and how you can manipulate those constraints to bring about the outcome that you want. So one example of a constraints-led approach that I implemented with my team that I actually got to teach. So one of the things we did on the program was we taught game sense or constraints-led approach, a drill with other coaches on the program. And then we got to receive feedback from them about, and it was really practical, which was great. And I think all of us were absolutely nervous because
of course,
some of the other coaches are just, super high caliber. But essentially, I created a constraints-based drill to focus on the skill of serve receive. So they were playing 6-on-6 and they were scoring, but the scoring could only happen on serve receive, which is the opposite of normally you can only, whoever wins the point wins the point. But in this case, you could only score if you were receiving. So that's sort of level one, and you sort of introduce that, see how it works.
Cool.
And then when they level up, the next constraint is, you can get 2 points if you return that ball really strongly with a kill, right? Because that's
Gotcha. Yep.
ideally what you want to do. So changing the mental part of defense off the serve into something more offensive. And then the next constraint was more about the mental fortitude to be able to do that when the game got really tight. So we did the exact same rules, but started the drill 18 all, playing to 25.
Okay.
So that idea that this is a pressure point in the game, they're serving at us. How can we return as strongly as possible, turn the game over and win the game or win the set? And so the idea of identifying what those constraints were and then trying to figure out how to manipulate them in a way that the players could understand and implement.
I love it. And your example of changing the rules where you'd earn a point for your quality of serve receive is manipulating a constraint on the task. So you've changed the rules of the game. And then next one around, it's now 18 all, you're now manipulating a constraint on the individual in terms of mental pressure under them. And we can also manipulate the environment. We can make the court bigger, smaller, and so forth, which is really, really cool. And for me, it's what I like about this is that you're able to successfully present new information to the participant for them to make a decision and then act upon that decision, as opposed to this is what you should do, this is how you should do it. It's I'm manipulating the environment one way or another, which presents new information to you. You then have to make your decisions and execute. I love it. It's really cool. It's really cool.
What was really interesting about that specific drill is that the girls identified that when the pressure got tough at that sort of third level, that if they didn't connect together, if they didn't come into the center and connect and have some sort of, cheer or something, that they went flat. And the teams that were able to implement that part, and they did that all themselves, they realized when pressure gets tough, they have to do that. And none of that came from me. So that was pretty cool.
Again, it leads back to self-reliance, empowering them. It's awesome. Hey, do you want to bring up that slide and talk through it for a minute?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Two?
So I just had some finishing things just about how the impact a coach can have on a number of variables. So one of the ones that really stood out to me about constraints-led approach is just the idea that we quite often will give tons and tons and tons of instructions. And we'll want players to do things in the right way, execute this movement in the right way, whatever that looks like. But sometimes that doesn't work for athletes. And it means that we create athletes who are moving unnaturally for them, which is the outcome that we want, but maybe not the best outcome for them. So I remember a while ago, I was talking to Mark Doyle, and I asked him, Mark, when you teach hitting, how do you do that? And he said, well, I just say to them, if you want to hit a volleyball, you need to jump as high as you can, go as fast as you can, and hit the ball as hard as you can, right? So that's the outcome. He's starting with the outcome. How they do that is actually irrelevant, entirely as long as they're doing it safely. And I'm thinking, holy crap, when I teach hitting, I go, and then we, and then we,
and this, and this, and this, and this,
right,
and this.
Exactly. Technicality, and I found that really challenging, but completely leads into that idea that we don't need to control everything. And oftentimes the outcomes come naturally from athletes.
And this is harder, isn't it? It's a hands-off approach. And it leads into, I can be really good at asking questions to draw the knowledge. It makes it it's more empowering for the participant because it's their knowledge that they're generating. And sure, it might require a little bit of patience and discipline as a coach, but the results that you can get from this kind of stuff,
absolutely.
Nice.
There's only a couple last things there, but essentially the idea of trying to increase the variability of trainings, which is actually the closest thing you could mimic to a real game, because we can't prepare athletes for every scenario in every competitive situation. But the more variable we make our trainings, the better they'll be. And just giving them those tools to be able to self-assess. But you got to do that at training in order to allow them to be doing that themselves during a game. So practicing that skill as well. Yeah, cool.
Alyssa, we could talk for hours, couldn't we? we could go on and on and on.
Yeah, 100%.
And I'm conscious of time and the participants on the call. What I'd like to do is anybody does. I'm going to close the call first and foremost, and then if anyone wants to stick around and ask questions, you're more than welcome to. We'll go through that process so that people don't have to kind of linger. I have put a poll up for feedback, and yes, one of the questions is, would you like to go and draw the Win Hugh McCutcheon's book, which isn't out in New Zealand until October, so you're very lucky to get this bad boy. So I'm going to close a couple of things, karakia, whakamutanga, and then if you wanted to stick around and ask a question to anyone on the call, to one of the panelists, you're more than welcome to. So just want to thank the group, the listener group, for your attendance, and to anyone who's watching the recording. To anyone post my closing for asking questions, adding their thoughts into the chat, so forth. Thank you especially to Alyssa, Natalia, Brianna, who some of you might see at Secondary School Nationals in a few weeks. Thank you for sharing your insights. I know it's not easy to share amongst peers and so forth, so kudos to you. And Andy, taking time to support our volleyball tribe. We appreciate your input and wisdom. I am going to share a link into the chat of our New Zealand Volleyball Coaches Network on Facebook. Some of you, most of you may already be a part of that. If you aren't already, jump on that. It's a place for us to kind of connect and discuss. I'll share opportunities and events, things like this. But we've already alluded to the importance of that community of practice, and that provides that opportunity for us. Karakia whakamutanga, kua mutu a mātou mahi mō tēnei pou, mana kitia mai mātou katoa, o mātou hoa, o mātou whānau, ki aia te whānau, ki aia te moana. Our work is finished for this time tonight. Bless us all, our colleagues, our families. Let the land be tranquil, let the sea be calm.